Opening the center for your pieces, this strike immediately fights for central squares and prepares rapid development. Immediately contesting the center opens a direct battle for territory, a classic response. Developing the knight strikes at black's central pawn, initiating a common duel for the board's heart. Developing the knight to c6 efficiently guards the e5 pawn and prepares for future central expansion. Developing another knight to bolster the center and prepare for pawn advances creates a harmonious setup. Developing the knight here immediately contests white's central pawn and prepares for castling. Fortifying the queenside pawn structure with a3, white prepares to expand, though it slightly concedes central influence for now. Challenging the center, black immediately opens lines and questions white's pawn structure, creating dynamic possibilities across the board. Opening the central files here offers a chance to develop pieces with initiative. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight here aims for central activity, but potentially surrenders some initiative. Unleashing a positional pin along the b5 f1 diagonal, this bishop aims to disrupt black's harmony and create potential weaknesses around the king, forcing a strategic decision on how to resolve the tension. Unbalancing white's pawn structure and immediately creating doubled pawns for the opponent is a bold, dynamic choice, potentially opening up the queenside for black's pieces and sacrificing the bishop pair for active counterplay, though one must be mindful of the doubled c-pawns becoming a long-term weakness if not properly addressed. Opening that b-file with the pawn thrust creates immediate central pressure and a clear avenue for the queen or rook, but it leaves your king's diagonal somewhat exposed and develops an awkward doubled pawn structure. Developing the bishop to d6 aims to solidify black's pawn structure on the kingside and prepare for potential castling, while also offering a pawn to white in exchange for opening lines for black's pieces. Unlocking the center's potential, this pawn thrust aggressively challenges black's piece harmony and opens crucial diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, aiming to seize the initiative with dynamic play. Exposing the pawn structure by capturing on d4 initiates a fascinating positional dance. Black sacrifices a pawn for active piece play and the potential to disrupt white's central control. This creates dynamic imbalances and requires precise calculation to navigate the ensuing complications. Initiating a forceful kingside attack with the queen, white interrupts black's central development and opens lines toward the enemy monarch, creating immediate tactical intrigue. Shielding the monarch while strategically repositioning the queen to a more active, central square offers crucial defensive stability and prepares for potential counterplay. Trading queens simplifies the position, leading towards an endgame where white's doubled pawns on the c-file become a structural weakness to exploit. Black should aim to activate their pieces, particularly the bishop and rooks, to pressure these pawns and gain an advantage in the ensuing simplified play. The recapture brings the black monarch into an exposed central position, a stark contrast to its previous sanctuary, potentially inviting immediate tactical complications as queens depart the board. This maneuver fundamentally alters the endgame dynamics, forcing black to prioritize king's safety while white can begin to exploit the open files and central pawn majority. The king's new central perch, while active, is a significant positional concession. Opening up the c-file offers white a clear avenue for piece activity, potentially pressuring black's weakened pawn structure. Initiating the fight for central space with the pawn advance, black aims to dislodge the bothersome bishop and gain a foothold on the queenside, potentially opening lines for their own pieces. This aggressive probing also serves to disrupt white's pawn structure, creating weaknesses that could be exploited later. The immediate consequence is forcing white to react, preventing them from comfortably consolidating their position and potentially reinforcing their central control. It's a dynamic response that seeks to imbalance the position and create active counterplay. Sacrificing the bishop to shatter black's pawn structure creates a permanent queenside weakness, offering white long-term pressure even after the immediate exchange simplifies the position. And importantly, it exposes the black king's pathway to the center in the upcoming pawn endgame. Opening the b-file for the rook and solidifying the pawn structure, though it leaves the king's pawn defense somewhat compromised, is a necessary consequence of the bishop's capture. Reclaiming the center and establishing a dominant pawn chain is the immediate strategic objective, aiming to restrict black's piece mobility. Black repositions the rook to its more active file, now that the central pawn tension has been resolved, aiming to contest the open e file and prepare for potential counterplay down that avenue. Developing the bishop to e3 aims to contest the open c-file and potentially put pressure on black's doubled pawns while preparing to castle kingside, a crucial step in securing the king and activating the rook. Navigating the king to a more protected square is paramount after the aggressive exchanges, and bringing the rook off its starting file offers future attacking potential. Prioritizing king safety now, white shuffles the monarch, aiming to tuck it away behind pawns and out of potential central skirmishes as the game transitions towards an endgame. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal opens up clear lines for the rook to join the fight along the central files, aiming to challenge white's pawn majority and exploit the weakened king position. The monarch scrambles to safety, seeking the relative security of the queenside's flank while seeking to activate its remaining pieces more harmoniously. Pondering the pawn advance on f6, black aims to solidify their king's sanctuary while subtly challenging white's central dominion. This pawn push, while seemingly defensive, sets the stage for a potential c5 pawn break, aiming to liberate the c6 pawn and disrupt white's structural integrity. Consider the long-term ramifications. Does it adequately support a future pawn advance, or does it create a permanent weakness that white can exploit? Think about how this move influences piece activity, particularly for the bishop on e6, which now has a clearer diagonal, and whether it hinders the g-pawn's development should the need arise. It's a nuanced decision, weighing immediate king safety against future pawn play and potential positional concessions. Asserting control over the b-file is a sensible ambition, aiming to leverage the open line for future pressure and potentially disrupt black's defensive structure around the queenside. Unpinning the rook from the defense of the d6 bishop opens up the b-file for immediate contest, signaling a shift towards aggressive pawn play and the potential for a kingside onslaught. The exchange of rooks here simplifies the position dramatically, initiating an endgame where black's king is somewhat exposed on the weakened squares around its original birthright. The rook's relocation to its freshly cleared sibling's former station immediately addresses white's kingside pawn's isolation, aiming to exploit the weakened light squares and create counterplay where previously none existed. Initiating a knight repositioning sequence, this move prepares to challenge black's entrenched pawn chain on the queenside, potentially opening lines for further pressure and creating opportunities to centralize the knight on a more active square. The bishop ventures out, eyeing the open diagonal and seeking to disrupt white's centralized king, a subtle bid for counterplay in a position where black's king's safety remains a paramount concern. Navigating toward a more active central presence, the knight repositions, aiming to redeploy and challenge black's pawn structure. This pawn thrust attempts to gain space on the king's side and potentially create attacking opportunities, but it simultaneously weakens the pawn structure and may invite a counterattack on the now compromised kingside squares. Initiating a kingside pawn thrust, white aims to disrupt black's developing harmony and potentially open lines for attack. A sensible defensive reaction, this pawn advances to create a safe haven for the king on the h-file and to prevent the oppressive influence of white's knight from reaching g5, thereby stabilizing black's slightly precarious pawn structure. Unlocking the h-file now presents black's king with a new, potentially uncomfortable avenue of approach, even if the immediate danger is minimal. White's pawn structure has been significantly altered, creating weaknesses that will demand careful defensive maneuvering. Finally confronting that pawn chain directly, black opts to recapture, creating a slightly altered pawn structure on the kingside. This decision brings the rook into a more active, central position on the open file, while simultaneously opening a diagonal for the remaining bishop to potentially influence the queenside. Consider how this opens new avenues for piece development and potential king safety reassessment. The knight's hop to a5 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure on the queenside by threatening to capture the c6 pawn, creating doubled pawns and potentially opening lines for white's rooks. This aggressive maneuver also repositions the knight to a more active square, surveying potential outposts and putting pressure on black's king once it's more exposed. Shifting the bishop to a more active diagonal, this repositions the piece to eye the weakened queenside pawn structure and potentially create counterplay. Unleashing an attack on the queenside pawn structure, white aims to disrupt black's king's safety and create potential weaknesses for a later invasion. Carving out a new path for the pawn advances the queenside initiative, potentially opening a clear diagonal for the bishop and challenging white's control of the kingside space. Opening a path for the queen to influence the queenside while also potentially restricting black's bishop's diagonal options. Bringing the bishop back to its active post, black aims to contest the crucial dark squares and prevent white's pawn storm from gaining unstoppable momentum. Introducing activity along the open file, this rook's ascent aims to challenge the opponent's queen's rook and potentially create weaknesses on the queenside. Safeguarding the monarch against potential discovered attacks and ensuring its retreat to a more secure haven is paramount after white's aggressive pawn push on the queenside. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside now to break open lines for the rook and bishop, although it does create some weaknesses. Activating the rook on the open file with the intention of challenging white's pawn structure is a logical step, though the immediate impact might be limited given white's king's central safety and active pieces. Deploying the bishop to f4 sharpens white's control of the central dark squares, a subtle but significant expansion that eyes the vulnerable kingside pawns and limits black's queenside maneuvering room, potentially forcing concessions or preparing a pawn storm. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to create mating threats or exploit open lines, but this risks overextending and weakening the king's sanctuary. Capturing the pawn on c7, you initiate a positional skirmish, creating an imbalanced pawn structure where white possesses the bishop pair in exchange for black's doubled c-pawns. This exchange might free up the d-file for your rook later, but it also weakens your kingside pawn shield and potentially offers black counterplay along the b-file if they can coordinate their pieces effectively. Consider how this pawn grab impacts the dynamic of the game, and whether it provides enough compensation for the potential weaknesses it introduces. The pawn storm gains momentum, a desperate attempt to unlock the kingside and create counterplay. Unlocking the d-file, white aims to shatter black's pawn shield and expose the compromised king's position, seeking to exploit the static weaknesses created by the pawn structure. Unleashing a forcing check, black immediately disrupts white's attempted pawn march and aims to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, seeking to exploit the king's somewhat exposed position and the open central files that are starting to emerge. Pushing the king forward into the thick of the action, this maneuver boldly aims to disrupt black's developing initiative and potentially create counterplay on the queenside, though it exposes the monarch to some immediate danger. Seizing the open file after white's king ventures forward, black injects immediate dynamism, forcing white to confront the exposed c-pawn and potentially disrupting white's pawn structure further. The white king, now liberated from the back ranks, actively seeks central domination, aiming to escort the remaining pawns and exploit the open nature of the board. Reclaiming a pawn and centralizing the bishop immediately addresses black's precarious pawn structure and opens up attacking avenues for the bishop. Unleashing a pawn advance to seize territory, this thrust aims to solidify central control and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure while opening avenues for further attack. Suddenly, a vital diagonal opens for the rook to shift onto the active e-file, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure and creating counterplay. Asserting dominion over the central squares with the knight's repositioning, this move aims to disrupt black's entrenched pawn structure and threaten potential breakthroughs, while simultaneously bolstering the white king's safety from further aggressive incursions. Unleashing a timely check, black immediately disrupts white's central control and forces a reaction, aiming to exploit the exposed king and potentially open lines for further attack. Relocating the king to c5 boldly seeks refuge from the discovered attack, aiming to regroup and potentially contest the open c-file. Although it leaves the monarch rather exposed on the queen side, should black's pieces coordinate effectively. Embracing the unexpected, black sacrifices the bishop for a pawn, disrupting white's central grip and opening a diagonal for the rook. Bringing the rook into play aims to contest the open g-file, but consider the potential for white's king to become exposed in this cluttered center. Unleashing the pawn's potential, this advance bravely pierces the flank, aiming to disrupt white's imposing rook and create a persistent threat on the king side. Safeguarding the outpost knight on a5 becomes paramount as the pawn chain on the queen side crumbles, but this retreat allows black's bishop to continue its menacing charge towards the weakened white king. Sensing an opportunity for a decisive breakthrough, the bishop ventures forth, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially create a mating net around the king. The knight's jump to d6 suddenly opens up a powerful avenue, threatening to infiltrate the kingside and disrupt black's already precarious pawn structure. White is now trying to exploit the exposed black king and its vulnerable pawn shield. Disrupting the central pawn chain's integrity, this audacious knight sacrifice aims to break open lines towards the enemy king, a desperate gambit for initiative when material advantage seems insurmountable. Controlling the dangerous queen hunt and rerouting the monarch to a safer square after that surprising knight sacrifice. The rook's arrival on the open file forces the white king to shift, potentially exposing it to further harassment and limiting its defensive options. The king bravely ventures out, but its journey through the center is fraught with peril as the rook on the open b-file creates a dangerous outpost for black's pieces, threatening to unravel white's pawn structure and disrupt any semblance of defense. Discarding the bishop for material now, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create passed pawns with the remaining queenside majority, though this exchange leaves white with a potentially strong passed pawn on c6 and an initiative in the center. The relentless advance of this pawn, supported by its knight, now aims to penetrate the black king's weakened defenses, creating a crucial turning point in the endgame. The king's escape route is now completely severed, leaving the black monarch exposed on the dark squares with scant protection. Sensing the imminent cascade, white captures the bishop, aiming to sever the last bastion of black's queenside counterplay and solidify the promotion threat of the c-pawn. Unleashing a desperate pawn thrust, black aims to disrupt white's tightly controlled central pawn chain and create unexpected mating threats before the inevitable pawn promotion on the c-file. A surprising check, forcing a material exchange that might simplify things too much for white at this late stage. Seizing the open file with the rook offers the king a temporary respite, but it also invites white's knight to become a formidable attacking piece on the king's doorstep. Clearing out the attacking knight, this liberates the pawn chain and prepares to advance the queenside majority, aiming to create a decisive passed pawn. The final piece finds its way to the open square, a desperate attempt to introduce some life into the otherwise stagnant position after the rook's unfortunate sacrifice. Opening a pathway for the knight to infiltrate the queenside and threaten the advanced pawn feels like the most logical step. Pushing the pawn to the 7th rank creates a dangerous threat of promotion, forcing white into a defensive posture to prevent the pawn from advancing further.